Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me here. So my talk will be very different to everyone else's because I'm a scientist. As long as the thing works, I'm happy about it. So I teach about climate and the atmosphere at Murdoch Uni, and I'm just going to summarize the work a lot of my PhD students have been doing for the past few years, how we use the compute and data storage systems, and also a few thoughts on moving forwards, what are the main issues we face as scientists in my field. So I'm going to talk about regional climate modeling for the southwest of Western Australia. So why do we care about that? So this is a map of the southwest, and the plot on the left shows you grain receival site production for 2010 compared to 2006-2009 average, and the one on the right here is 2013. So red is bad. Turns out that 2010 was a very, very dry year for the southwest. So most of the cereal crops we grow in this region relies on, is rain-fed. So we don't irrigate all that much in this region. So we rely on the rainfall in June, July, August. So climate plays a pretty big role in grain production. So that's important. We need to know something about that. You might know that the southwest also produces quite a lot of wine. We don't necessarily produce the most wine in Australia, but we do produce some of the premium red varieties, especially along the south coast. And wine, the same type of grape will give you very different taste from year to year, and a lot of that depends on what the climate is doing. So some varieties are quite susceptible to minimum temperatures, others depend more on how much it rains and when, and how that times with when the crop is flowering. So that's pretty important as well. Why do we care? Again, this is a global map of what we call internationally recognized biodiversity hotspots. That's where you have many different types of fauna and flora, lots of species diversity. And the southwest of Western Australia is one of these places in the world which is recognized for having huge biodiversity. And that's linked with climate as well. So what I'm saying here is climate is important. Something else which applies to Australia as a whole is bushfires. So this is just showing you a few satellite pictures of bushfires we've experienced in the past. It's very important to understand bushfire dynamics. How is the bushfire climatology going to change in the future? And how do we respond quickly to bushfire emergencies? So you need atmospheric models to answer these sort of questions. So if you look at the long-term trends in climate for this region, this is from the Bureau of Meteorology website, and it's showing you the maximum temperature anomaly. So red means it's been getting warmer than average, and you can see sort of a clear warming trend. So that's 1960 to 2016. And if you look at winter rainfall, we seem to be having a consistent drying trend since the 1970s also. And most of the projections tell us that the trends are going to keep going in this direction. So we need to think about that. So in terms of planning for the future, well, you need to make projections about future climate change. So how do we do that? We use these things called global climate models, which try to solve the physics of the climate system. So this is showing you projections from several global climate models from the International Panel on Climate Change. It's showing you the change in temperature. The first plot, these three plots are just different scenarios. So the top one is kind of a business as usual scenario where we keep our current rate of emissions of greenhouse gases. And the bottom two are or better scenarios if you want. But the thing here is that this is a graph for the Southwest. The projection is towards increasing temperatures. You will see a lot of shading on these graphs that captures the uncertainty within the models. So you can look at the same thing. This is from global climate models, but for precipitation projections, the main story here is getting drier. Okay, so this is useful to know. This is what the best climate models are telling us what's going to happen in the future. But these models have a spatial resolution, which is about 100 to 250 kilometers. What I mean by that is climate models or gridded models, like imagine a mesh around the globe, and each one of these meshes, these squares or rectangles, represents about 100 to 250 kilometers, right? So each of these grid boxes, inside each of these boxes, you will get one simulated temperature, one value for simulated precipitation. That box will have one value for the topography. It will have one value for the dominant land use type, etc. So they're quite coarse. So if you think about a region like the southwest of Western Australia or any other region, it would only be represented by 4 or 5 grid boxes. So if I go back to the first slide I showed you, from a global climate model, you would typically get a box this big, and that one box will have one temperature value. And if you want to go and talk to a farmer and tell them about what might happen at their farm, well, showing them a map where there's big boxes and each box has one value in it isn't really telling them something useful, because they need to know what's going to happen at the regional scale. So to try to find a solution to this problem, we use these things called regional climate models. So you take the outputs from global climate models and you dynamically downscale them to a finer scale. By fine scale, I usually mean 1 to 10 kilometers. So now each box is 1 to 10 kilometers. So then that gives you a bit more useful information on what's happening at the regional scale. So that's what we do. So use these regional climate models to dynamically downscale global climate models to a finer spatial resolution, so we can develop policy which is relevant to people on the ground. Okay, so the schematic of how this works, you have your global climate model. If you can imagine boxes all around the globe, each box is about 100 to 200 kilometers. That's what it represents. So you take an area of interest from your global climate model. At the boundaries, you get all the data you need, and you feed that into a regional climate model. Now, you can't go from, say, 100 to 250 kilometers straight to 5 kilometers, because you're going to break the physics of the atmosphere. You can't go, it's too big of a jump. So what you do, you go from 150, or depending on the model, let's say it's 200 kilometers, for argument's sake. Then you say, okay, I'm going to go from 200 kilometers to 50 kilometers over a big area. And then from that 50 kilometer one, I'm going to go to 10 kilometer. Oops, from that 10 kilometer one, I'm going to now downscale to 5 kilometers. So then information is transferred from the bigger domain to the smaller domain to the smaller domain and so forth. So you can then focus on what's happening in your region of interest. Okay, so what do we do at Murdoch? Well, we use some of the best regional climate models we can find to dynamically downscale some global climate models, and we try to answer some questions as to what's going to happen to cereal crop production, viticulture, and bushfire weather in this region. So to do that, we use the HPC resources from POSI and also the data storage facilities. So I'm just going to show you some few results. So this graph here, every row is a different climate index which matters to someone who's growing wheat or any cereal crop in the region. All right, so we don't need to worry too much about what it means for now, but it's just an index which is useful. The first thing you want to look at is the column here on the right where it says OBS. This is the real world. This is what we get by interpolating observations. So that's the real world. And then the first 4 columns is each a different model simulation driven with a different global climate model. So in an ideal world, we want all of these, the first 4, to look like the last one. So obviously we can see some models do better at some indices. They all get the overall pattern correct, which is good, but they all have different magnitudes of errors. Now that you know something about the ability of the model to produce the observed climate, you can now look at what's happening in the future relative to what's happened in the past. So this is what is shown on this graph here, that was work done by one of our PhD students. Now you're looking at the change. So red here means it's getting warmer, blue means it's getting cooler, and each one of these rows is a particular climate index which matters if you're growing wheat in the region. The first 3 are each a different model simulation, and the one on the right is the ensemble mean. So you take the mean of everything. So what it's telling us is that, especially in the northern parts, we'll probably have some issues with regards to growing the same varieties of wheat that we're growing at the moment. So something else which matters is viticulture, so wine production. What I've plotted here is an index called a Hugling index. If people who grow grapes to grow wine, they know about this index because it's an important one. So this is the observed index. Each one of these here is a model simulation. And what is shown at the bottom is the model minus the observations. So this is the bias. In an ideal world, we want things to be very close to 0. So anything which is white is good. Red, it's overestimated. Blue, it's underestimated. And we've only plotted the wine regions here, so we've masked out everything else. So what you can see here is a systematic issue with the model, that it tends to overpredict that index a lot, especially around the coast. So that is an issue we need to fix. It doesn't seem to be related to the driving model. It just seems to be something systematic. This is again showing you a different index. This is the cool night index. It matters for some varieties of grape, depending on what sort of wine you want to produce. The one thing with this is that most of the models are pretty good. This particular one has an issue in that it tends to overpredict that index by quite a lot. So that's one of the reasons we use many different models, because not one of these, they're all incorrect, but some are more useful than others. So you have to bear that in mind. Same thing here, yet another index which is useful if you're interested in growing grapes to produce wine, is the growing season precipitation. And this is telling us that the model seems to have a systematic problem in that it underpredicts precipitation, which is not unheard of. So that's been recently published. Now that we know something about the ability of the model to produce real life, you can now look at what's happening in the future versus what's happened in the past. So this is what is shown here. Anything which is red means that it's whatever that index is, the value is bigger. And where you find the stippling, it's where it's statistically significant. But the long story short with this is that some of the wine grain regions along the northern part might not be sustainable for too long going into the future. If you've driven around Australia enough, you would have seen some of these warnings. They're bushfire warnings. They rate from low to catastrophic. So how do we come up with these warnings? They are based on something called a MacArthur Forest Fire Danger Index. It's based on temperature, humidity, wind speed, and soil dryness. So that's how these warnings are generated. And something else we wanted to do with all our simulations is to look at how well does our model simulate this index, because it's quite important. It's what we use for bushfire weather warnings. So here I'm showing you an example of where the model does a good job, which is the top 2 plots, and where the model does a bad job, which is the bottom 2 plots. So the blue lines is the observed, red line is the simulated, where it's a solid line is just a time series of the actual value, and the dotted line is just a linear trend fitted to the time series. So for the first 2 plots, you can see we're going in the same direction. We don't get things perfectly, but it's going in the right direction. The bottom 2 plots, the model and the observations are going in different directions, right? So that's got something to do with how we represent urban land use in the model. So it's something we're trying to improve. But it's just showing an application. So we do this with a model called the Weather Research and Forecasting model, which is very, very commonly used among university students and academics. Written in Fortran 90, it's open source. It runs pretty much on any Nix type system. So that's what we use. But in terms of the bigger picture, I guess this is what this conference is about, really. The sort of challenges I think we face is that we all talk about the top 500 list, but in the climate sciences, one of the big problems we face is that it's very data heavy. We produce stacks and stacks of data, but although data storage facilities have improved significantly over time, I think it tends to lag behind. So for many applications, having a bigger computer doesn't necessarily mean people will be able to use it unless you have data storage infrastructure behind it. So I think that's an issue we face pretty much everywhere, not just here in Australia. The other thing is, does a bigger HPC equals better science? Yes and no. One of the big problems we face in my field is that climate models, thousands and thousands of lines of Fortran written by many different people. Scientists are notorious for writing really bad code. It tends to be spaghetti-like. It's very difficult to follow through what's called what and when. So I think just by having a big HPC, we run higher resolution simulations, but I have a feeling that we have less and less people, we have more and more people running models, but less and less people who know exactly what's going on behind. Because we're developing more and more complex models, but we also need help to understand what's really happening behind the scenes. I think that's how we really do better science, is not just by having more powerful computers, but also, we need to train scientists to be better code writers as well. In terms of data sharing, again, we've come a very, very long way. There's many resources to scientists these days to share their data. But again, I think there's a long way to go to make. It's one thing to make my simulations public. It's something else that a user will use it correctly, right? So I find we talk a lot about let's push as much as data possible out there, but then sometimes we forget that it might be used in the wrong way. So there's that fine balance I think we need to find. There's no easy answer to any of these questions, but hopefully we're moving towards that. So these are just some of the publications we got out of all of this work, mostly done by students. So if anyone is interested, so that's the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Yep.
Do you think there could be consulting services that around these data sets for stations?
I think so, yeah. 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 I think there's a gap. Like scientists like myself, we spend our time teaching, supervising students and reviewing papers, and then the HPC people are busy making the system work and responding to our emails. There is a niche out there. There is, and I don't think it's there's a lot of potential. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yep.
How would you like to use WRF? Are you modifying that?
So WRF is one of the few models which is one of the easier ones to modify. And you can modify it without worrying too much about the MPI level. So yes, we do make minor science modifications to improve some of the science behind it, yeah. But again, that's one of the rare models where it's actually not too bad. Some of the other ones, it's you think you fix something and you made it more to obey the laws of physics better, but then everything else breaks and you have no idea why. Happens all the time. Yeah. Yep.
Just wondering how you're going to develop better sort of scientific insight into your, the codes that you're using, taking into account, John's talk this morning about just fundamental uncertainties in the numerics all the way through to how do we weigh the physics,
Yep.
How well we've done a good job of the physics, what's going on in the code, not understanding the interrelationships between the different physical components,
Yeah.
as you've mentioned. I mean, it's quite a sort of a deep problem,
Yeah.
isn't it?
I mean, this will horrify many of you, but climate scientists have only started using Git OSVN the past 4 or 5 years. Very common, and that's bad. Like people would be emailing about around turbos and, oh, here's my version, here's your version. So we started now that everyone's using proper code bases and repositories. So that's step number one. Reproducibility is another one. So we had, some of my colleagues had issues running their ocean model that you would get very different answers depending on whether you run on 64 cores or 128 cores, and it would actually matter in terms of the science sometimes, but sometimes not, and no one really knows why. So there's so many things to make better. So, yeah, I don't have a straight answer to that, but the good thing is we're talking about it. People are certainly aware of it. I don't think we have enough people around to try to really tackle these head on. But which comes to your point, there's a niche for consultancy to somehow contribute to that. Yeah.
This might be research.
Yeah. Thank you.